if you'd have asked me that question back in the mid to late 50s, I'd have said yes, that most Americans would have been in favor of the war in Vietnam. The times back there were a little different. I remember I was just finishing college, and even at school, the teachers were all in favor of the war, and that was kind of unusual. It'd be unusual today. My parents, relatives, neighbors, they were all talking about the possibility of being involved in a war in Vietnam. And the big issue was communism. None of us wanted to live under communism. We felt that at that time, that had we not gotten involved, the world might have been communistic. So I would say most people were in favor of it. I remember this, by the time we got involved over there, Vietnam had already split into two nations. You had North Vietnam, which was communist, and you had South Vietnam, which was basically more capitalistic. They wanted a free society. So that's how the war actually began. Um, when we entered the war, I remember one thing that was very common. A lot of people were saying that if we did not get involved, that all of Southeast Asia would become communist. And that was a scary proposition. So I would have been in favor of course, knowing what I know today, hindsight is always 2020. And I'm not sure that we should have gotten involved because over 50,000 young men lost their lives during that war. And that was a real problem. Um, I think that pretty much answers that question. Well, the attitude of American people had changed as the war progressed. I remember television and radio. Television was actually fairly new then. We didn't even have a TV in our house until I was 13 years old. So television, most people got their news from radio as opposed to television. And I remember the war stories that we heard, everything was positive. Everything was going great. I mean, we were winning the war. But as time went on, that proved not to be true. We were fighting a very unconventional military over there. It was called the Viet Cong. They were much like today's Hamas, Boko Haram, ISIS, today's terrorists. No uniforms. So when we go into a village to wipe out this communist threat in North Vietnam, we were fighting people we didn't even know whether it was villager or Viet Cong. They all looked the same. So it put our military at a big disadvantage. Um, I think public sentiment then started to change. Once we started hearing that we were not winning the war, in fact, we may have been losing the war, public sentiment started to change. And when it changed, everything kind of went with it. I remember um, a lot of the young men that were being called up, but remember, at that time, there was a draft. People were drafted, and there was no women in our Army or Marines, Navy. It was all men, and they had a draft, and everybody was eligible for the draft, every man. And so a lot of young men were actually leaving the country to avoid the draft. I remember I had a college friend. His name is Hal. He actually moved to Calgary in Canada to avoid the draft. He ended up living with his aunt and uncle till all the things that I think it was years and years before he came back. Um, I reported, I remember, to the draft board. Um, I think I was 21. I was married, and I got a call to report to the draft board. I was already classified as a 1A, and I got there, and they'd asked me if anything changed in my draft status, and I said no. I'd gotten married, and they said, "Well, do you have any children?" And I said, "No, my wife is pregnant with our first child." And so they said, "Well, we're going to have to give you a temporary deferment. And if the baby is born healthy, and we hope it is, bring your birth certificate in and we'll reclassify you as 1C." And that happened. The baby was born healthy, and I was reclassified as 1C, and therefore I never had to enter the military. And my parents were pleased, but most young men my age were actually willing to go and sacrifice for their country. That was a good thing. Risk of riots. Well, there weren't really many riots back then, like there are today. There were protests. sit-ins. And the reason that we didn't have riots back then, or very few of them, is the police were given a lot more leeway. If you were involved in a riot and you were doing something that was against the law, you would pay a price for it. So mainly it was love-ins and sit-ins, and I would say the demonstrations were more like marches, yeah, back then. And then Hollywood got involved, just like they are today in most situations like this, especially where war is involved. And the primary Hollywood star that was involved back then was Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda was a big star at that time, and her father, Henry Fonda, was even a bigger star. But I remember she left this country and flew to North Vietnam. She draped herself with a Viet Cong flag, and she sat, and I can't remember if it was on a tank or I think it was a cannon, but she sat on that tank with that Viet Cong flag on her, and that really riled a lot of people here in this country. Nonetheless, sentiment had changed, and also at the same time, the hippie generation taken place, and the hippies were much like today's young homeless people. They really didn't want to work. They enjoyed smoking pot, begging for money. They liked psychedelic music. Basically smoked pot all day and listened to music. And they got involved in the demonstrations as well. And at the same time, you had a lot of parents of young men who died, who were also turning against the war. So the general sentiment then became, we want to get out of Vietnam. And civil rights protests also were taking place at the same time. So you had a whole bunch of things going on, and it made it almost impossible for us to stay in a war. Was I ever involved in a protest? Yes, actually I was. It didn't have to do with the war. A young lady had come in with her grandma into a store. I was working as a salesman in a furniture store. And they were black, and her grandma was just like a grandma to me. I loved her to death. And she bought some furniture from me. Well, she kept coming back every couple months. She'd buy a lamp, she'd buy pillows, she'd buy something. And I loved her like a grandma. And I remember her asking me if I would be willing to go with her on a Saturday morning and protest at the state capitol for civil rights. And I did. I met her there, I think it was at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning. And I actually marched for about 4 blocks with her and other blacks and some whites for civil rights. So that was going on. The war was going on. There was a lot of issues, and so no, I never really participated in a what you'd call certainly not a riot or even a protest. It was a civil march.